Our gospel lesson this morning is found in the second book of the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark. Scholars have concluded this is likely the earliest of all four Gospels. And our lesson today is found in chapter 12. Mark chapter 12, beginning at verse 28. One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that Jesus answered them well, he asked him, "Which commandment is the first of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." Then the scribe said to him, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said that He is one, and besides Him there is no other. And to love Him with all the heart and all the understanding and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself, this is much more important than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices." When Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And after that, no one dared to ask him any question. What does Jesus mean when he talks about the kingdom of God? Or in other Gospels, the kingdom of heaven. What does Jesus mean when he talks about the kingdom of God? Where is this? What is it? What's it like? Whereas some other Gospels, Matthew and Luke, start with stories of angels and shepherds and wise men and a baby in a manger. And John begins with this long treatise about theology. Mark's gospel begins by jumping directly into the adult ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. Mark chapter 1, verse 15 is Jesus' first sermon, and the first words that Jesus preaches are, "Time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God has come near." Again and again throughout Mark's gospel, Jesus goes back to this original theme from his first sermon about the kingdom of God, and revisits it, touches on it again and again. Whatever the kingdom is, Jesus seems to say, it has come near in Jesus himself. It has arrived with his arrival. He continues on. Most of chapter 4 of Mark's gospel is about the kingdom of God. It seems to be found, the kingdom, within a story that has a deeper meaning than it might appear on the surface. For example, it's mysterious. It cannot be pinned down. So in chapter 4, Jesus tells the story that says the kingdom of God is like a farmer who may not understand the science, may not know all that much about how agriculture works, but he knows that it does. He knows that a seed planted in the ground will give a yield. And so he participates in the planting and harvesting process. The kingdom is like that, Jesus says. Or Jesus continues on in chapter 4 and tells another story. He says the kingdom is like this. It's like how you can take the tiniest of seeds, something that looks like it might be insignificant, and certainly nothing of any significance could come from something so small, so minuscule. And yet, by the mystery of God, that tiniest of seeds can produce a giant plant. The kingdom of God is something like that, Jesus says. In other words, you never know. You just never know what sort of eternal significance can come from even a tiny act within the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God is closer than you think, Jesus says. It's already in our world, and yet it's out of this world. Jesus continues on in Mark chapter 9, preaching about, teaching about, living out the kingdom. Mark 9, Jesus teaches there are some here who will not see death until they realize that the kingdom of God has already come with power. They may be expecting that at the end of this life they will go to some other realm where they will behold the kingdom of God. Jesus teaches in Mark 9, some will realize before they transition into the great unknown that the kingdom of God is already among us. And the kingdom of God, Jesus says, is more profound than earthly wisdom. This is the message he delivers in Mark chapter 10, starting around verse 13. He says, the gospel, the kingdom message is so profound that it eludes the brightest and most scholarly folks. In fact, the number one qualification in order to understand the kingdom is to be like a child. A child will get it. A child will grasp it. There's something about that childishness that allows them to grasp the kingdom. So what is Jesus talking about? Well, it's almost easier to paint a picture of confusion or a picture of what Jesus is not saying. What is he teaching about the kingdom? Something like this. The kingdom of God is a place without a set geography. The kingdom of God is a mindset that you never fully understand, and yet it makes the most sense. The kingdom of God is never fully known, and yet it feels like home. The kingdom of God is a purpose that pulls you forward as opposed to motivating you from behind. The kingdom of God is God little by little, more and more taking possession of your life. What Jesus seems to be saying is that every so often we get a glimpse. We get a glimpse of the kingdom at times when we least expect it, perhaps. Those of you who were here Wednesday night heard Sable Snyder tell her story about coming back from Haiti and reflecting on what had happened there with our mission team this summer. She talked about one day in particular where she and some of the team members were painting with oil-based paint. And so by the time the noonday meal came around, they were covered in paint. And where they had tried to take the paint off of their hands, they had used gasoline, essentially, to try to strip the paint off. And so they knew it wasn't safe to eat their meal with gasoline-soaked hands. And so they wandered through this village looking for some way to get the gasoline off their hands so that they could enjoy a noontime meal. That's when one of the villagers noticed them and recognized that international look of confusion that goes beyond all languages and offered assistance. This person led Sable and some of the team through the village streets and to her home and into her home and to the bucket that contained all of the water that was available to that household for that hour, for that day, and perhaps longer. It's hard work to get clean, fresh water in inland Haiti. And yet that's what she offered to Sable and to some of our team members. She used her scarce water so that our team of volunteers could eat their meal. And Sable says, because of that act, she'll never be the same again. A glimpse of the kingdom of God can come at the least expected time, even when we think we are the agents of God's kingdom. That's the moment when the kingdom of God can be ushered in to our lives. So in this passage, in Mark chapter 12, verse 34, what does it mean then that Jesus concludes this little encounter he has with the scribe by saying of the scribe, this man is not far from the kingdom. That phrase is one that I had never paid attention to. And yet it has been in the back of my mind for weeks. What is Jesus saying here? Not far from the kingdom. To paraphrase Presbyterian pastor Frederick Buechner, every once in a while, he writes, God's kingly will is done in various odd ways among us. And at those times, the kingdom has come already. But at this particular moment, on the other hand, or any given moment, all the odd ways, the strange and bizarre ways we do God's will are at best half-baked and half-hearted. At those times, the kingdom is still a long way off. It's both and. The kingdom is here, and yet it is remote. Buechner suggests we could think of this word kingdom in terms of kingship, or what you and I might call citizenship or nationality. That is to say, even if I am outside the geographical boundaries of my kingdom, my nation, the place where I am a citizen, I am still a citizen. Even if I am away from my king, the king is still my king. My identity as a resident of the kingdom of God is unchanged wherever I may go. So Jesus says, this man is not far from the kingdom. He seems to be saying to him, you have made significant, sizable strides toward the kingdom of God, toward taking on this unshakable identity as one of Christ's own. And yet, despite these significant strides, still you resist. Still you resist opening your life to permit my kingship in your life. What is it then that Jesus affirms? He sees something. Excuse me. He sees something in this man. In Mark chapter 12. Something that stands out to him at verse 28. The scribe saw that Jesus answered him well. This refers to the previous story, the one from verse 18 through verse 23, where people have asked Jesus one tough question after another. It's not about marriage licenses in that previous story. It's about the power of God to be able to change and shape the lives of God's children. It's about God's love breaking into our world. And the scribe has understood this, and Jesus affirms it. It's the ability of recognizing God, reaching God's love into our hearts. So verses 32 and 33, the scribe has affirmed Jesus, and Jesus in turn affirms the scribe. Imagine that. Someone being so bold as to say to Jesus of Nazareth, well done. As if we are capable of measuring, assessing the good that Jesus does. Loving God, loving neighbor. The scribe says, Jesus got it right. And then, thank you, John. Thank you. And then he adds. Imagine adding to what Jesus says. Love God, love neighbor. And the scribe says, that's more important. It's more important than whole offerings and sacrifices. Now that's quite a statement. This is quite a moment, even if it takes place on a dusty hillside out in the middle of nowhere. But think of the context here. Where are they gathered? This is the final week of Jesus' life in Mark's gospel. Every day he is going back to the temple to teach and to preach. And the scribe, one of the leaders of the law, and Jesus, the great rabbi, are standing within the temple itself. And in this exchange, the scribe says, yes, right living, loving God, loving neighbor is more important, more profound, of greater value than what all these folks around us are doing through their worship in the temple. What Jesus affirms about this man seems to be his ability to understand the weightier matters of the law, and perhaps most importantly, his ability to discern true worship. True worship regardless of location. True worship, much like the kingdom, that happens regardless of place or power. Wednesday night, I was at the fellowship meal that we have every week. It was delicious. And by the way, the mixed berry dessert with the little buttery, crumbly crust was just outstanding. You can tell Kim I said that. So Wednesday night, I was at the meal, and I was seated with the Metters. And their son, George, their adopted son, Georgetown College international student George, was there with them at the table. And after a long time, we had probably been talking to George for 35, 40 minutes. He started talking about what he is experiencing, not just at Georgetown College, but as he interacts with the Metters family and with our church at large. And he began to say things like this. He said, I'm from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and yet this is how it should be. I asked him to repeat that. Did I hear that right? He said, yes, this is how it should be. He says, I'm not from here. I'm from the Congo. I have a friend of a friend in West Virginia who is making it possible for me to be here as a student. Eventually, he would say, I am Catholic. I'm not a Baptist or even a Protestant. But you share with me, he says, and you welcome me, he says, and you live the gospel. He recognized something held in common when his anxieties had recognized all of these would-be barriers. He could see there was something held in common between us, regardless of culture, regardless of faith group within the tree of the Christian faith. And then he used this word. It is like pre-kingdom. George had no idea what I was preaching about this week. He said, it's like pre-kingdom. It's like a glimpse before the kingdom. I think what George was saying is this. This is what heaven will be like. Barriers will be torn down. Fellowship between believers will be paramount. And what I'm experiencing here among you, despite all of our differences or apparent differences, is what heaven will be like. And I see among us true worship. The best news I can say about this wondrous mystery of love that is the kingdom of God is this. The best news I can say is that the kingdom of God is a gift. The kingdom of God is a blessing. Jesus is recognizing all of these wonderful things about this man, and yet he could just as easily celebrate the Father. Because Jesus makes it possible. He's like that double-decker bus driver or the cab driver that takes you right to the gate of the place that it is that you're wanting to visit. Through the love of Jesus Christ, we are brought right to the front gate of the kingdom of God, and we are dropped there with every invitation and every possibility to enter into the life of the kingdom. And so what Jesus is saying about this man is the same thing Jesus is saying about all of us. We start out life not far from the kingdom because God has created God's children. God has made us in God's image. And whether we, like this man, have taken a few steps toward the kingdom, or we stand with knees knocking, wondering where the kingdom is, not realizing that it's right behind our backs, Jesus offers this same gift, this same blessing to each one of us. God's love is breaking in to our reality, calling for us to love God and love neighbor. And it all begins with this gift. Now, I don't know about you, but I was raised in a home where if somebody offers you a gift, at the very least you think hard about accepting it. There may be one today who has never said yes to the gift God offers of life in the kingdom. Life where you and Jesus can be together in a crowd much like this one, even if everything else is swirling around you out of control. You and Jesus walking in lockstep together. And if you would like to enter into life in the kingdom, a life of loving God and loving neighbor, and recognizing the Spirit of Christ dwelling within you, then all you need to do today to take that step to the kingdom is to say yes. Say yes to what is freely given, what is offered out of the overflow of God's goodness. Our musicians are coming forward now to lead us into a time of response. Some will want to respond by serving in ministry, and we'll share with you some opportunities for ministry in just a moment. Some will want to say yes by contributing to an offering or a love offering, an exit offering for world hunger and local benevolence. But if you are one who has never given your life to Jesus Christ, accept Him today. Even as we are singing, we ask that you would step forward and share that decision with us, that yes, it's time for me to accept life in the kingdom. Or perhaps you're ready to say, I have been a resident of the kingdom for a long time, but I need to be in fellowship with this church. I need to be a member of Georgetown Baptist Church. We'd ask that you would share that or any other decision that you're making for Christ today. You're not far from the kingdom. Won't you come in? Let us stand together and sing.